Grace opened her eyes to find herself lying on cold medical equipment inside a human research facility. The massive chamber stretched out before her with walls of pure white metal that seemed to pulse with a soft blue light. Her dragons were not here, and immediately panic seized her heart. Shadow and Ember had always been with her since childhood, their bond so strong that being separated from them felt like losing a limb. A woman with dark hair and kind eyes approached Grace slowly, speaking in the common language that all the refugees had learned to understand over the past few seasons. Her name was Dr. Maya Rodriguez, and she had been the one to convince Grace to volunteer for the experiment in the first place. Maya explained that the dragons were being kept in a different section of the facility for their own safety and comfort. They were being monitored and cared for by specialists who worked with dragonkind every single day. Grace did not like this separation, but she understood the necessity. The human scientist needed to study her individual responses to certain stimuli before they could measure the combined effects of dragon bonding. Maya showed her to a comfortable living space within the facility, where she could rest and prepare for the first set of tests. The room contained soft furnishings, natural light from large windows, and a small garden of flowering plants that reminded Grace of her home in the floating cities. The first few days of the experiment involved basic physical examinations and interviews. Doctors and scientists came and went, asking Grace questions about her life, her training as an elf warrior, and her earliest memories of bonding with Shadow and Ember. They took samples of her blood and measured the unusual energy signatures that seemed to exist within her body at all times. Grace had never truly understood why she was different from other elves. Most of her kind possessed minimal magical ability, but Grace had always burned with an inner fire that allowed her to communicate with dragons on a level that most elves could never achieve. On the 5th day of her captivity, because that is what it began to feel like despite the comfort and kindness shown to her, Grace was finally allowed to see her dragons again. The reunion was explosive and overwhelming. Shadow roared so loudly that it shook the entire chamber, his silver markings blazing with brilliant light. Ember launched herself at Grace with such force that the impact drove all the air from her lungs. Grace fell to the ground laughing and crying at the same time, her hands running over their scales to assure herself that they were real and whole and unharmed. Maya watched from a safe distance, taking notes and recording the data. The energy readings were off the scale. The instruments had never measured anything like what was happening in this moment. When Grace and her dragons were reunited, the light in the chamber brightened to nearly blinding levels. It was as though they had become a single entity made of pure power and emotion. Maya knew immediately that this experiment was going to change everything they understood about interspecies bonding. After this first meeting, the experiments became more structured and controlled. Grace was brought to a special chamber designed specifically for dragon interaction. The space was vast and open, with high ceilings and reinforced walls made from materials that could withstand dragon fire. Shadow and Ember were brought in separately at first, and Grace worked with scientists to demonstrate the various ways that she and her dragons communicated. She showed them how she could send thoughts and emotions to Shadow through concentration and will. She demonstrated how Ember responded to subtle changes in Grace's breathing and heartbeat, adjusting her own physical movements to match her rider's needs. The human scientists were fascinated and somewhat troubled by what they witnessed. They had theories about psionic communication and energy manipulation, but nothing in their scientific understanding could fully explain the connection that Grace shared with her dragons. It transcended the mere physical. There was something spiritual and mystical about it, something that could not be measured by instruments alone. Weeks turned into months inside the facility. Grace settled into a rhythm of testing and observation, but she never fully adapted to her confined existence. The windows in her living space showed her the world outside, and she could see the distant mountains and forests that lay beyond the human settlement. She missed the freedom of flying through open skies on Shadow's back, the feeling of wind rushing past her face while Ember soared nearby, their dragon calls echoing across the vast emptiness of the wild lands. Maya began to spend more time with Grace outside of the official testing hours. She would sit with Grace in her living space and they would talk about life and family and dreams. Maya came from a military family but had chosen the path of science instead of combat. She believed that understanding was more powerful than any weapon, and that knowledge could bridge divides that seemed impossible to cross. Grace found herself drawn to Maya's passion and intelligence. Despite their different species and backgrounds, a genuine friendship began to form between them. It was during one of these informal conversations that Maya first mentioned the possibility of the barrier failing. The dimensional gates that humanity had used to enter this world were becoming unstable, she explained. The energy signatures showed unusual fluctuations, and some of the older scientists theorized that a catastrophic event was coming. Maya did not believe that the barrier would fail completely, but she acknowledged the risk. Grace felt a chill run down her spine as she listened. If the barrier did fail, everything would change. The delicate balance that had allowed humans and elves and dragons to exist in cautious proximity would be shattered. Grace spent that night unable to sleep, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. She reached out through the psychic connection to Shadow and Ember, asking them to come to her. Even though they were housed in a different part of the facility, they responded to her call. Security personnel found Grace standing at the window of her living space, with her 2 dragons somehow occupying the room beside her, without having been brought there by any normal means. The facility went into alert status, but Maya convinced the commanding officers that Grace had not broken any rules. The dragons had simply responded to their bonded rider, which was exactly what the experiment was meant to study. After this incident, restrictions were loosened. Grace was allowed to spend more time with Shadow and Ember, outside of the official testing chambers. They were even permitted to go to an outdoor courtyard on certain days, where Grace could feel the wind on her face, and her dragons could stretch their wings beneath the open sky. During these sessions, Grace began to teach some of the human researchers basic techniques for dragon communication. Not everyone could learn it, but a handful of the younger scientists showed promise. They began to understand that the bond between elf and dragon was not something that could be fully replicated, but elements of it could perhaps be shared. As the months progressed, Grace noticed that the scientists were running tests that seemed to go beyond simple observation and measurement. They were trying to understand how to artificially create or enhance the psychic connection between humans and dragons. Some of these experiments were conducted on hybrid creatures that had been brought into the facility. These hybrid beings were part dragon and part something else, something mechanical or artificial. Grace found these creations disturbing, yet she also pitied them. They were trapped between 2 worlds, not fully dragon and not fully anything else. One evening, Maya came to Grace with concerns written across her face. She confided that there were military personnel within the facility who wanted to weaponize the dragon bond. They wanted to create soldiers who were connected to dragons in the same way that Grace was connected to Shadow and Ember. Maya disagreed strongly with this approach, but she was only a scientist. She had no power to stop the military officials from pursuing their vision. Grace realized then that her presence in this facility served purposes beyond simple scientific curiosity. She was being studied not just to understand dragon bonding, but to determine how it could be used for warfare and conquest. That night, Grace made a decision. She would not allow her bond with Shadow and Ember to become a tool of war. If necessary, she would escape this facility and return to the floating cities. But even as she thought this, she knew that running was not the answer. The humans had come to this world, and they would not simply disappear. If she abandoned them now, what would happen to those humans and elves and dragons who might benefit from understanding? Grace realized that she had to stay, but she also had to ensure that her dragons and the knowledge of their bond would not be used to cause harm. She spoke to Maya about her fears and her determination. Maya listened carefully, and then she told Grace something that would change everything. She revealed that the dimensional barrier was showing signs of imminent failure. The scientists had detected unusual energy spikes over the past few weeks, and the latest data suggested that a catastrophic rupture could occur within days or even hours. When that happened, the research facility would become extremely dangerous. Everything inside those walls would be at risk. Maya believed that Grace and her dragons might be the only hope for saving the people trapped inside if disaster struck. Grace spent the next 2 days in heightened awareness, watching the facility for signs of the impending disaster that Maya had warned her about. The scientists continued their work with increasing urgency, running calculations and double-checking their data. Some of them began to evacuate personal items from the lower levels of the facility, moving them to higher ground. Security personnel started conducting emergency drills, though the official explanation was routine maintenance and safety protocol updates. Shadow sensed the anxiety and unease that permeated the entire compound. The great black dragon with his silver star markings would pace through the outdoor courtyard, his scales shimmering with agitated energy. Ember, smaller and more volatile by nature, periodically released bursts of flame that had to be quickly extinguished by the facility's automated fire suppression systems. Grace spent as much time as possible with them, trying to keep them calm through their psychic connection. But her own fear was too strong to completely mask. The dragons felt it, and it only made them more restless. Maya came to Grace 3 days after their serious conversation. She looked exhausted, as though she had not slept properly in days. She held a data tablet in her hands, and the expression on her face was grave. Maya explained that the barrier fluctuations were accelerating beyond all predictions. Instead of days, they might have only hours before a major rupture occurred. The higher authorities in the facility were discussing evacuation procedures, but evacuation would take time that they might not have. If the barrier failed suddenly and catastrophically, the rupture itself would tear through the structure of the entire research installation. Grace asked Maya directly what she wanted from her. Maya hesitated. Then she said that Grace needed to understand the full scope of the experiments being conducted in the lower levels of the facility. There were creatures down there, hybrid beings that were created through combinations of dragon genetics and human science. These hybrids were intelligent and sentient, capable of thought and emotion, but they had never seen open sky or felt wind on their wings. If the barrier collapsed and the facility was destroyed, these hybrids would die trapped in their sealed chambers with no one to help them. Maya wanted Grace to know about them because she believed that Grace and her dragons might be the only force powerful enough to break through the containment chambers and free them. Grace did not refuse. Instead, she asked Maya to take her to see these hybrid creatures. Maya knew that this was against facility protocol and probably against military law, but she also knew that Grace needed to see the truth before making any decisions. They moved through the facility at night, using Maya's security clearance to bypass locked doors and security checkpoints. They descended deeper and deeper into the underground sections until they reached a level that was cold and sterile, lined with containment chambers made of reinforced glass and specialized alloys. What Grace saw inside those chambers haunted her. There were dragon-like creatures, but they were wrong somehow. Twisted amalgamations of natural dragon physiology and artificial components. Some had metal woven into their scales. Others had strange crystalline structures growing from their bodies. But what was most disturbing was that these hybrids were clearly conscious and aware. They looked at Grace and Maya with eyes that conveyed desperate hope. These creatures had been imprisoned their entire lives, with nothing but the white walls of their chambers to define their existence. One particular hybrid caught Grace's attention. This one was smaller than the others, with scales that were a pale blue color and wings that seemed partially translucent. When Grace looked at this hybrid, she felt a faint echo of intelligence and emotion through her psychic senses. Somehow, this creature had a spark of the same connection that Grace shared with Shadow and Ember, though the connection was weak and distorted, as though it had been artificially constructed rather than naturally developed. Grace placed her hand on the glass of the chamber and the hybrid moved toward her, pressing its own scaled appendage against the glass from the inside. Maya explained that this particular hybrid, which the scientists referred to as Unit 7, had shown unusual promise in the bonding experiments. It had been exposed to the same techniques and stimuli that the humans had used to study Grace and her dragons. Unit 7 had even bonded partially with one of the human researchers before the experiment was halted due to safety concerns. The human had suffered severe neural damage from the incomplete bonding process, and the military commanders had ordered that no further attempts should be made. Unit 7 had been isolated ever since, essentially imprisoned for being too successful at the very thing the facility was designed to study. Grace felt a surge of anger and sadness. She understood now that the military was not interested in creating harmonious bonds between humans and dragons. They wanted to create weapons, controllable tools that could be used for warfare and conquest, and they did not care how many lives were destroyed in the process, whether those lives were human, elf, dragon, or hybrid. Grace made a decision in that moment. She would not simply escape when the barrier failed. She would return and save these creatures, even if it meant risking her own life and the lives of Shadow and Ember. They were returning to the upper levels when the alarms began. At first, it was just a soft warning tone, a gentle electronic hum that seemed almost peaceful. But within moments, the alarms escalated to an ear-splitting shriek that echoed through every corridor and chamber of the facility. Red emergency lights flashed in sequence, casting everything in an ominous crimson glow. The barrier rupture was happening. Maya shouted over the noise, and it was happening now. The facility's intercom system came to life with emergency broadcasts. All personnel were ordered to proceed to evacuation zones immediately. Evacuation shuttles would begin launching in 20 minutes. Those who were not at evacuation zones when the shuttles departed would be left behind. The announcement was repeated over and over, a mechanical voice that betrayed no emotion about the fate of those who would be abandoned. Grace and Maya ran through the corridors toward the upper levels where Grace's dragons were being held. The facility was in chaos. Scientists and military personnel were rushing in all directions, some heading toward evacuation zones and others seemingly frozen by panic or indecision. The walls of the facility began to show visible cracks as stress from the dimensional rupture was transmitted through the structure. Small pieces of the ceiling fell, and some sections of the wall flickered with an ominous, otherworldly light that seemed to be tearing through from another reality. They reached the dragon holding area to find Shadow and Ember already breaking through their enclosures. The black dragon's power and fury combined with Ember's volatile flame were systematically destroying the barriers that contained them. When Shadow saw Grace, he let out a roar that was part greeting and part explosion of pent-up rage. Ember threw herself at Grace, nearly bowling her over with the force of her embrace. The three of them were finally reunited, and the connection between them flared into brilliant luminescence. Maya grabbed Grace's arm and pointed toward the exit. "They could not stay in this section," she said, because the entire northern wing of the facility was showing structural failure indicators. They had to reach either the evacuation zone or find shelter in one of the reinforced bunkers. Grace knew that if she went to the evacuation zone, she would be leaving those hybrid creatures to their deaths. She looked at Maya, and she saw in her friend's eyes that Maya already knew what Grace was thinking. Maya pressed an emergency key into Grace's hand and told her the code that would unlock the lower-level containment chambers. Maya said that she would try to delay the evacuation shuttle as long as possible, give Grace time to reach the hybrids and attempt a rescue. But Maya was clear about the odds. If Grace went down to the lower levels now, she might not have time to reach the evacuation zone before the entire facility became too unstable to navigate. Grace accepted the key and the sacrifice that Maya was offering. She embraced her friend, thanking her for her courage and her faith. Shadow understood immediately what Grace needed to do. The dragon lowered himself, allowing Grace to mount his back, and Ember flew in spiraling circles around them both. Together, they turned away from the evacuation zone and moved instead toward the stairs that would take them into the depths of the facility where the hybrid creatures waited for salvation or death. The lower levels of the facility were descending into chaos as the dimensional rupture spread its effects deeper into the structure. The walls themselves seemed to be phasing between solid matter and something ethereal and insubstantial. Grace could see through some sections of wall where reality itself appeared thin and fractured. The air crackled with energy that made her skin tingle and her teeth ache. Shadow navigated carefully, his powerful claws finding purchase on floors that still remained stable. Ember flew above them, her wings catching strange light from the rifts in reality that were opening up around them. The descent seemed to take forever, though Grace knew that only minutes were passing. Time felt distorted in this lower section of the facility, as though the rupturing barrier was affecting the basic flow of temporal progression. They encountered other personnel moving desperately upward, trying to reach the evacuation zones. Some of them attempted to stop Grace and her dragons, believing that she was heading in the wrong direction and needed to be redirected towards safety. Grace could not stop to argue with them. She had only one purpose now, and that was to reach the hybrid creatures before they were destroyed. Finally, they reached the chamber level where the containment tanks were located. The damage here was extensive. Several of the glass enclosures had already shattered, releasing a strange fluid that had sustained the hybrids through their entire lives in captivity. Some of the creatures lay motionless in the spreading puddles of this artificial sustenance. Grace felt her heart sink as she realized that many of these hybrids might already be dead or dying from dehydration and trauma. But Unit 7 was still alive. The pale blue hybrid was pressing against the damaged section of its enclosure, trying desperately to break through. Grace ran to the chamber and used the emergency key that Maya had given her. She keyed in the override code, and the metal seals that held the chamber shut began to release with a hissing of pneumatic pressure. Unit 7 burst from the chamber and immediately collapsed on the floor, its body weak from years of confinement and the sudden exposure to open air. Shadow approached the hybrid carefully, his ancient draconic intelligence allowing him to understand the situation immediately. The great black dragon extended one of his enormous claws and gently touched the pale blue hybrid, establishing a connection. Grace felt the moment when Shadow's mind touched Unit 7's consciousness. It was like watching two isolated islands suddenly discover they were not alone. Shadow began to transfer strength and energy to the weakened hybrid, drawing on the deep reserves of power that came from centuries of dragon existence. Grace moved quickly through the chamber level, using the emergency key on every remaining intact containment chamber. She did not have time to open all of them, but she managed to release at least 15 of the hybrid creatures. Some of them were barely conscious and had to be supported by the others. Some tried to flee in panic, but Grace called to them through their fragmented psychic connections, urging them to stay together and follow her to safety. Ember worked to clear the corridor of fallen debris, her dragon strength easily moving obstacles that would have been immovable for a single human. As Grace gathered the hybrid creatures, she became aware of a strange phenomenon. The hybrids, now freed from their individual sealed chambers, began to develop stronger psychic connections to each other. They formed a collective consciousness that was not quite unified but definitely shared. Grace could sense their confusion and fear. But underneath those emotions was also a desperate gratitude. They had been condemned to solitary imprisonment their entire lives, and now they were finally able to communicate with others like themselves. Unit 7 had recovered enough to stand on its own by this time. The hybrid approached Grace and attempted to communicate through the incomplete psychic link. The connection was painful and imprecise, but Grace understood the core of Unit 7's message. The hybrid was asking Grace why she had come back for them. Why would she risk her own life to save creatures that the humans themselves had rejected and imprisoned? Grace did not have time for a lengthy explanation, so she simply sent the emotion of compassion and determination back through the link. That seemed to satisfy Unit 7's question. Suddenly, the entire facility shook with a tremendous impact. Somewhere far above them, part of the structure was collapsing. Great cracks appeared in the walls of the chamber level, and the fluid from the broken containment tanks began to spread across the floor. The dimensional rupture was accelerating, and the entire facility was beginning to destabilize at an increasing rate. Grace realized that she had only minutes before this section of the facility would be completely uninhabitable. She gathered all the hybrid creatures she could manage and began leading them back toward the stairs. Shadow and Ember formed a protective formation around the group, using their bodies to shield the weaker hybrids from falling debris. The journey back up the stairs was treacherous and terrifying. More than once, Grace thought that they would not make it. Stairs crumbled beneath their feet. Walls collapsed behind them, cutting off their escape route and forcing them to find alternative pathways through the crumbling infrastructure. They were forced to navigate through sections of the facility that were not designed for dragons or large groups of creatures to pass through. Shadow's large frame sometimes had to squeeze through narrow corridors, and in some cases he had to use his immense strength to enlarge doorways and passages. Ember's flames occasionally burned away obstacles, though Grace tried to minimize the use of fire given the structural instability of the facility. The hybrid creatures followed close behind, their weak bodies determined to push forward despite their suffering. At one point, they encountered a section where the dimensional rupture had created an actual rift in space. The barrier between this world and whatever lay beyond was visible as a shimmering tear in the air itself. Grace could see something moving on the other side of the rift, something vast and incomprehensible. For just a moment she felt the attention of something enormous and alien focus on her. She felt its recognition and its curiosity, and then Shadow was pulling her away from the rift, his mental voice sharp with warning. Whatever was on the other side of that dimensional barrier was not something that Grace wanted to encounter. They finally reached the upper levels of the facility just as Maya had feared. The evacuation shuttles were already beginning their launch sequences. Grace could see the massive vehicles starting to rise from their landing platforms, carrying the facility personnel away from the disaster. But Grace was not looking for the shuttles. She was looking for a way to get the hybrid creatures into open air, where they might have a better chance of survival. The facility's main entrance had been damaged by debris, and the doors were hanging loose on their hinges. Grace led the group through the broken doorway and into the chaotic scene outside. There were other personnel fleeing in all directions. Military personnel were trying to establish evacuation checkpoints, but the chaos made their efforts largely ineffective. Nobody tried to stop Grace's group as she moved through the external courtyard. Outside, beneath the open sky, the situation was both better and worse than inside the facility. The air was clear at least, and gravity and physics seemed to be working normally. But the dimensional rupture was visible from here as an enormous wound in the sky itself. The barrier between worlds had torn open completely, and reality itself seemed to be unraveling around the edges of the rift. Strange light poured through the rupture, and the ground shook with continuous tremors as the facility behind them continued to collapse. Grace realized that the hybrid creatures would not survive long without shelter or specialized care. Their bodies had been adapted to live in the artificial environment of the containment chambers. The open air and the intensity of the dimensional rupture were already taking their toll. Several of the hybrids were displaying signs of physical distress. Grace looked at Shadow and Ember, and she made a decision that would change the course of history for both the human and dragon worlds. Grace made contact with every hybrid creature simultaneously. Through the collective psychic connection that they had developed, she sent them images of what was necessary. She showed them the bond that she shared with Shadow and Ember, the deep connection that went beyond mere communication or companionship. She showed them the power and protection that came from this kind of bonding, and then she extended an offer that no hybrid creature had ever been given before. She offered them the choice to attempt the bonding with each other. The hybrid creatures understood immediately what Grace was proposing, and they understood the danger. The incomplete bonding between the hybrids and the human researcher had caused severe neural damage. Attempting a full bonding between creatures that were not naturally compatible could be even more dangerous. But the alternative was certain death. Staying in the collapsing facility, or remaining exposed to the dimensional rupture without protection, would result in their destruction. At least bonding offered a chance. Unit 7 stepped forward first, moving toward the nearest other hybrid creature, a taller being with scales of deep purple and crystalline protrusions along its spine. The two hybrids approached each other cautiously, and Grace helped guide them through the process. She used her own connection with Shadow and Ember as a template, showing the hybrid creatures how to open their minds to each other, how to merge their consciousness while still maintaining individual identity. The process was difficult and painful, but it worked. When the bonding was complete, the two hybrids glowed with the same ethereal light that Grace had learned to produce. Encouraged by this success, the other hybrid creatures began to form pairs and attempt bonding with each other. Grace moved among them, providing guidance and support, using her own psychic strength to help stabilize the connections where they were unstable or incomplete. Not every bonding was successful on the first attempt. Some hybrid creatures rejected the bonding after trying, but many were able to establish the connection, and each successful bonding created a new unit of power and mutual protection. The entire process took only 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity to Grace. By the time the last hybrid creature had either successfully bonded or chosen to remain unbonded, 8 new dragon-like partnerships had been created. The 8 unbonded hybrids would need to find other ways to survive, but at least the bonded ones now had a chance. Grace turned her attention to those 8 and began rapidly teaching them techniques that might help them survive in the wild world. Beyond the facility grounds, Maya emerged from the collapsing facility just as Grace finished working with the final group of hybrids. The human scientist was covered in dust and bleeding from a wound on her forehead, but she was alive. She ran toward Grace and wrapped her friend in a desperate embrace. Maya explained that she had personally delayed the final evacuation shuttle as long as possible, making sure that every available person had the opportunity to escape. She had almost not made it out herself. The dimensional rupture in the sky above them was expanding at an accelerating rate. The boundary of the rift was now so large that it cast a shadow over half the facility grounds. Grace could see energy pouring through the rupture, raw power from a dimension that existed parallel to their own. The research facility was beginning to literally disintegrate as the barrier between worlds became thinner and thinner. Grace realized that the rupture would not stop on its own. If it continued expanding at its current rate, it would eventually tear apart the entire region, possibly the entire world. She felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She'd been brought to this facility to help the humans understand dragon bonding, but instead she was being called upon to stop a catastrophe that she had not created and did not fully understand. Shadow approached Grace and pressed his massive head against her body. Through their connection, Grace felt the great dragon's determination and power. Shadow had lived for hundreds of years, and during that lifetime he had encountered many challenges that required more than mere physical strength. He sent Grace images and concepts that slowly resolved into understanding. There was a way to close the rupture, Shadow was telling her, but it would require a bonding so powerful and complete that Grace and her dragons would have to merge their consciousnesses completely. They would become a single entity rather than 3 separate minds linked together. Grace understood the risk immediately. If the bonding failed or was incomplete, she might lose her individual identity forever, becoming merely part of something larger and no longer distinctly Grace. But if she did not make the attempt, the dimensional rupture would continue to expand until it destroyed everything. This was not a choice made between options. This was a choice made between sacrifice and the death of everyone in this region. Ember flew in circles around Grace, her fiery wings creating patterns of light in the air. The smaller dragon added her support to Shadow's proposal, sending messages of courage and determination. The two dragons had been with Grace since childhood. They had shared everything with her, the joy and the sorrow, the danger and the safety. They had always been willing to face any challenge as long as they faced it together. This moment was no different, except that now they were being asked to take that togetherness to a level that had never been attempted before. Grace made her decision. She moved to a central position between Shadow and Ember, and she placed her hands on each of their bodies. She felt their minds reaching out to hers, and she reached out to meet them. The bonding began slowly at first, a gentle merging of consciousness that felt natural and right. But as the bonding deepened, it became more intense and overwhelming. Grace began to lose the sense of where her mind ended and the dragon's minds began. She experienced the world through 3 sets of eyes, felt the wind through scales and skin simultaneously, understood language and emotion in ways that no single consciousness could have managed. The 3 separate beings were becoming one, and as they bonded, their combined power grew exponentially. Grace felt herself expanding, becoming something greater than she had ever been individually. She became wings and teeth and ancient wisdom. She became sword-like speed and calculated grace. She became the culmination of everything that she and her dragons could achieve together, unified into a single consciousness that was simultaneously 1 and 3. In this merged state of being, Grace turned toward the dimensional rupture and focused her attention on the wound in reality. She could see the nature of the rupture now with her expanded consciousness. It was not a simple tear. It was an anchor point for something vast and intelligent that was attempting to open a doorway into this dimension. Something was on the other side, pushing, trying to create a permanent passage. Grace understood that if she simply sealed the rupture without dealing with what was behind it, the attempt would eventually be made again. Grace, Shadow and Ember working as one unified consciousness, reached through the rupture toward the vast intelligence on the other side. They made contact with something ancient and powerful, a being of pure energy and consciousness that existed in a realm beyond human and elf understanding. The being communicated its intent directly into Grace's unified mind. It had been drawn to this dimension by the exceptional power of the bonded beings that existed here. It wanted to understand them, to study them, possibly to consume them and gain their power for itself. Grace sent back her own message with the combined authority of elf, dragon, and the strange hybrid creatures that had just bonded with each other. She told the entity that this world and these people were under her protection. She showed it the power that could be brought against it if it attempted to force its way through the barrier, and she offered it an alternative. If the entity would withdraw its push against the rupture, Grace and her bonded companions would agree to share knowledge about the nature of bonding and consciousness. They would become ambassadors between dimensions, creating peaceful exchange rather than conquest. The vast intelligence on the other side of the rupture considered this offer. Grace felt its attention assessing her, measuring her power and her truth. After a moment that felt like both an instant and an eternity, the entity agreed. It withdrew its push against the barrier, and Grace seized the moment. Using the combined strength of 3 beings merged into one consciousness, she began to seal the rupture. The process of sealing the rupture consumed every bit of power that the merged consciousness of Grace, Shadow, and Ember possessed. The dimensional tear shrank rapidly, pulling shut like a wound being stitched closed. The strange light that had poured through from the other dimension faded away, and the sky returned to its normal color and appearance. The ground stopped shaking. The sense of reality being torn apart subsided, and everything became still and quiet. And then Grace felt herself separating. The unified consciousness that had briefly become something greater than any individual entity was beginning to fragment back into its original components. Grace experienced the sensation of being divided, of losing the vast awareness that had allowed her to perceive everything simultaneously. It was like waking from an extraordinary dream and returning to the limitations of normal consciousness. The process of separation was painful, like being torn apart from the inside. But Grace understood that this pain was necessary. She and her dragons could not exist in the permanently merged state. They were too different, too individual for such a joining to be anything but temporary. The separation completed, and Grace found herself back in her normal form, standing between Shadow and Ember in the courtyard of the research facility. The massive black dragon was breathing heavily, His scales dimmed to a dark charcoal color as though his energy had been completely drained. Ember was barely able to stand, her wings drooping with exhaustion. Grace herself felt as though she had aged 100 years. Every muscle in her body ached and her mind felt foggy and confused as she readjusted to existing as a single consciousness rather than three. But they had succeeded. The rupture was closed. The dimensional barrier was restored to its original integrity. The catastrophe that had seemed inevitable only minutes before had been prevented. Maya rushed toward Grace and caught her as her legs gave out beneath her. The human scientist held Grace's weight and lowered her gently to the ground, speaking words of gratitude and praise that Grace could barely hear through the fog of exhaustion. The other survivors of the facility began to emerge from whatever shelters and locations they had hidden in during the chaos. They saw the sealed sky and the stop to destruction. They saw Grace and her dragons standing at the center of the courtyard, radiant with the residual energy of what they had accomplished. And they understood that something momentous had occurred, something that had saved their lives and changed the nature of their world forever. Military personnel and scientists approached cautiously, uncertain how to react to what they had witnessed. Some of them attempted to offer assistance to Grace and her dragons. Others maintained a respectful distance, recognizing that the three bonded beings needed time to recover. Maya worked to coordinate the response, making sure that shelter and medical care were provided to everyone who needed it, including the hybrid creatures who had survived the facility's destruction. The hybrid creatures were changed by their bonding with each other. They were no longer the artificial laboratory constructs that they had been when imprisoned in their containment chambers. They had become something new, something that existed between the categories of dragon and machine, natural and artificial. They possessed much of the strength and capability of true dragons, but they also retained the human-like cognition and flexibility of thought that had been engineered into them. The bonded pairs among the hybrids moved together with synchronization that rivaled Grace's connection with Shadow and Ember. Unit 7 and its bonded partner approached Grace with careful respect. The two hybrids communicated through their merged consciousness, and the message they sent to Grace was simple but profound. They thanked her. They expressed gratitude for being given the gift of consciousness and freedom after a lifetime of isolation and imprisonment. They pledged themselves to Grace's service and to the cause of maintaining peace between the human, elf, and dragon worlds. Grace accepted their pledge and she extended her friendship to them, recognizing that these beings were now part of her extended family. Over the next several days, the survivors of the facility began to organize and plan their next steps. The evacuation shuttles that had departed during the crisis had carried personnel and information about the experiment, about Grace and her dragons, and about the bonded hybrids. Word of what had occurred spread quickly through the human settlements and military command structures. Some people celebrated Grace as a hero. Others viewed her and the dragons with fear and suspicion, seeing them as potentially threatening forces that needed to be monitored and controlled. Maya advocated strongly for a peaceful approach to working with Grace and her dragons. She gave presentations to military commanders and political leaders, explaining that the bond between different species was not a weakness to be exploited, but a strength to be cultivated. She argued that the way forward lay in cooperation and mutual respect, not in attempts to weaponize or control the dragon bonding. Her arguments were persuasive, and gradually, the military commanders agreed to support a new initiative focused on developing peaceful coexistence between humans, elves, and dragons. The research facility was partially repaired rather than abandoned. Under Maya's continued leadership, it was transformed from a military experimentation site into a place of genuine scientific study and education. Humans, elves, and dragons came there willingly to learn about bonding and communication and the ways that different species could work together. The hybrid creatures were brought in as teachers, sharing their unique perspective and demonstrating the possibilities that bonding offered. Grace maintained her connection with Shadow and Ember, but she also began to develop new connections with other individuals and communities. She traveled between the human settlements and the elf floating cities, acting as a bridge between the different peoples. Wherever she went, she worked to demonstrate that cooperation and mutual respect were possible, that beings from different worlds and different types could learn to understand each other. 5 years after the dimensional rupture and the facility disaster, Grace stood at the edge of a thriving settlement that had been established in a region that was previously considered too dangerous to inhabit. The settlement was populated by humans, elves, and bonded dragon pairs. They had built a society together where different species worked toward common goals, and celebrated their differences as strengths rather than weaknesses. Shadow rested his massive head against Grace's shoulder, his silver markings glowing softly in the evening light. Ember coiled around Grace's feet, her scales reflecting the colors of the setting sun. Maya stood nearby, speaking with the settlement leaders about plans for expansion and development. The hybrid creatures who had been freed from the facility were now spread throughout various settlements, each bonded pair working to improve the lives of their human and elf communities. Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had volunteered for an experiment that had seemed focused on understanding dragon bonding, but it had become something much larger. It had become a journey toward unity and peace, and humanity did not merely survive in the dragon realms anymore. They breathed as part of it, as one people united by magic, science, friendship, and the unbreakable connections that Grace and her companions had helped to forge. The future was uncertain, as all futures must be. There would be challenges ahead, times when the bonds would be tested, moments when conflict and misunderstanding would threaten to destroy what had been built. But Grace and Shadow and Ember faced that future together, along with all the humans and elves and hybrid creatures who had chosen to be part of their great work. They had learned that bonding was not just about individual connection. It was about creating networks of understanding and support that could hold an entire world together. As the stars began to appear in the night sky above them, Grace reached out with her consciousness and felt the web of connections that spanned the world now. She felt the bond with Shadow and Ember as always, strong and true and unchanging. But she also felt the connections to Maya and the other humans who had embraced cooperation. She felt the presence of the elves who had chosen to step down from their floating cities and live among the communities below. And she felt the unique consciousness of the hybrid creatures, those beings created through human science who had found their purpose and their place in the world. The dream of dimensional exploration that the vast intelligence on the other side of the barrier had possessed would have to be set aside. The barrier between worlds would remain closed, at least for now. Perhaps in the distant future, when the peoples of this world had achieved a level of unity and peace that was even stronger than what existed now, they might reconsider communication with beings from beyond the dimensional divide. But for now, Grace was content to focus on the world she lived in and the connections she had helped to build here.